The Magic in the Marrow by Tygermine. A Dramione fanfiction. Summary. Auror Inspector Malfoy is making forensic scientist Hermione Granger's life difficult. If he's not dragging her to a crime scene, he's invading her dreams. Chapter 1. That's Dr. Granger, if you please. Their fingers accidentally brushed as they both reached for the sugar sachets on the condiment table in Bean Me Up that morning. Hermione felt as if she touched a live wire, sending a jolt down her spine and straight into her knickers. He didn't pull his fingers away as she'd expected. Instead, he lightly ran his fingertips up her hand and tightly wrapped them around her wrist. "I recall hearing a Muggle song about pouring sugar on someone," he whispered, turning her towards him. "Is that a thing Muggles actually do?" She wanted to roll her eyes at him, but they widened as she watched him reach for a sachet with his other hand and bring it to his mouth. He bit into it and tore the packet open, accidentally spilling a few granules on his shirt and hand. Hermione leaned in and licked the sweetness from his fingers, enjoying the sharp breath she heard him pull into his lungs. "Come on, Malfoy," she teased. "Pour some sugar on me." With a slight tremor in his hand, he pulled her shirt open and sprinkled the sugar along her collarbone. Dropping the sachet onto the floor, his hand buried itself in her hair and drew her forward so he could suck the granules up as he worked his way across towards her neck, licking until the sweetness faded away. Her hands went straight for his belt, unbuckling it to give her access to his button and fly, which she made quick work of. She traced the bulge of his cock through his silk boxer briefs. Her exploration was cut short as he reached around the back of her thighs and picked her up to rest her arse on the nearest table, pushing her skirt up to bunch at her waist. Starting at her knees, he ran his long fingers down the inside of her thighs until he reached her knickers. He lifted the elastic edges, peeling the cotton from her wet folds before releasing the elastic with a snap. The sting made her moan and shift her hips closer to him, scrambling her fingers at his underwear, pulling it down to free his erect cock. He pushed the cotton knickers to the side and let her guide him towards her core. She could feel his cock vibrating in her hand. Buzz, 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 buzz. Hermione sat up with a jolt, the constant vibrating buzzing from her wand, clenching her fist under the pillow. That could only mean one thing in her life these days. Someone found human remains. The crime scene was in an alley just off the main thoroughfare of Diagon. Aurors had blocked off the entrance whilst a few Auror inspectors spoke to the poor wizard who had found the body. Auror Caxton, a young, newly graduated addition to the force, met Hermione at the entrance to the alley. "Miss Granger," she started. "Doctor," Hermione interrupted. "Right, yes, Dr. Granger." Auror Caxton paused for a moment, caught off guard by the correction. Hermione walked farther down the alley, taking in the crime scene. "As you can see," Auror Caxton caught up with her, "we haven't touched anything to preserve the scene, as you wrote in your book, which, may I say, is absolutely revolutionary in solving crimes. Would it be impertinent to ask you to sign me a copy?" Her request was met with a blank look from Hermione before she purposely turned her attention to the remains. "The remains, of course, sorry," Auror Caxton stuttered out. "Auror Caxton, what have you found so far?" A deep voice cut in from the entrance of the alley. Draco Malfoy walked down the alley towards them, carrying 2 steaming cups in his hand. He went to stand next to where Hermione was crouching, examining the remains. "I haven't given my assessment yet," Hermione said. She spotted the cup Malfoy held out to her. "What's that?" "The elixir of life, Granger." "That's not a real thing." She took the cup from him, and a whiff of strong coffee sent a montage of flashbacks to flicker through her mind. Hermione felt the heat rise in her cheeks and found herself unable to look Malfoy in the eye. The remains were safer to examine than the smirk on his face. "Very little flesh left, possibly removed by scavengers based on bite marks on the bones. Pelvic bone suggests the victim is female. Now the skull has circular orbits and a heart-shaped nasal aperture. This suggests Asian descent." Auror Caxton took frantic notes as Hermione spoke and opened her mouth to ask a question, but was cut off by Malfoy.
Body dump?
You haven't asked for the cause of death yet, Hermione pointed out, digging a gloved finger into the mouth of the victim and running it along her teeth.
If you knew that, you would have told us already. Drink your coffee, Granger. I don't like it when you're not fully awake. Now, confirm it's a body dump, please.
Hermione gave him a hard look. Well, it was aimed at the spot over his shoulder, so she was sure she wouldn't blush again, and took a big gulp of her coffee. Malfoy pulled a sugar sachet out of his pocket, bit one end and tore it open before dumping the sugar into his cup. Give, He licked the granules from his lips, and Hermione almost choked on her tongue. Given the lack of wildlife in the surrounding area, she forced out, turning away from him to look at the remains, as well as the absence of blood spatter, I'm 100% confident that this is not a murder scene. She turned to Caxton. Cast the appropriate protection charms and have the remains transported to the lab. Keeping her eyes firmly fixed on the ground, Hermione removed her gloves and began to walk out of the alley, Malfoy dogging her steps.
Isn't it nice to be working together again?
His smile was sincere, making her instantly stop just outside the alley. If I didn't know better, you committed a non-magical murder just to take me away from my research, which is annoying.
Oh, come on, Granger. I'm sure your paper on the native tribes of New Guinea and their penchant for eating their dead relatives is a real page-turner. But this is solving crimes. It's noble, and you are nothing if not noble.
She pushed past him in a huff. I'll have you know, my research on the origins of the magic genome is very important.
But solving murders is much more fun,
he said, following her. Don't you have aura duties to perform?
Thanks to our last case, I got a promotion. Supervising Auror Inspector now, which means Caxton does all the work and I just make sure she arrests the right suspect.
Then why are you following me?
I want to be near the action when you find the cause of death.
Hermione gave him a sidelong look. Fine. Just don't distract the team from their tasks.
It's not my fault if your intern finds me distracting, he said as she disapparated after throwing her coffee cup in a nearby bin.
Auror Inspector Malfoy?
Yes, Caxton?
Why does she use the title of doctor? Shouldn't it be healer?
Caxton, Granger is more of a scientific doctor. I think the full title is forensic anthropologist, which I think is just a fancy muggle term to say she prefers working with dead bodies over living people.
Her methodologies are groundbreaking, and to apply them to our work has made our casework that much better.
She's not around to hear you kiss her ass, Caxton.
I know, I'm sorry, sir. No ass-kissing intended. But, sir, could you ask Dr. Granger to sign my copy of her book?
Caxton, solve this case and I'll guarantee it, he replied before disapparating to the lab.
Chapter 2. You're a puzzle. The lab was housed in a converted warehouse along the Camden Canal. From the outside, it looked like any of the Victorian-era warehouses that were scattered all over the district. Only a small brass plaque near the door announced its presence. Specialized Pathological Logistics, Investigations and Forensic Foundation. SPLIF, for short. The interior was all stainless steel and modern equipment with offices and specialized labs lining the perimeter, while the center housed the main examination area. Hermione was standing over the remains that were laid out on an examination table, pointing out interesting finds to her intern Malcolm. Notice the microfractures to the base of the skull.
Have a cause of death yet, Granger?
Malfoy strode up to the examination table, but kept his hands in his pocket.
Auror Inspector Malfoy, with all due respect, we haven't completed our initial examination yet, Malcolm spoke up. Dr. Granger cannot give you anything until we've concluded our investigation. Then what can you tell me?
Anything now is pure supposition. I'm not comfortable drawing conclusions without the proper evidence to back it up, Hermione said, her head still bent down over the remains. Malcolm, we'll need to do an isotope analysis and see if there was any trace evidence left in the fractured rib bones.
Isotopes? Isn't there some sort of charm you can use?
Malfoy huffed in annoyance. Hermione straightened and removed her gloves and headed towards her office. Malfoy followed her closely.
Come on, Granger. Surely you know a charm to make this process far less tedious, he drawled as he closed her office door.
Charms are fallible and inaccurate. The only thing I have so far is a facial reconstruction. That's the one charm that seems to work properly. She waved her wand and a 3D image appeared between them. The victim was pretty, with almond eyes, a button nose, and full lips. Her black hair was pinned straight and hung to her shoulders. Based on this, she is from Southeast Asia, possibly Thai, probably a second-generation immigrant to the UK.
No identification?
Nothing from the ministry, but we need to send this to the Muggle authorities as well.
I'm not getting the Muggles involved in this. They always turn it into a sideshow.
You just hate all the want jokes they make, Malfoy sniffed.
It's juvenile and pointless, and I'm not allowed to say anything back, or else it's a vicious circle of disciplinary hearings and pointed remarks about my tattoo, and I really don't need that in my life right now. How long must I wait for actual information so I can begin my investigation?
Hasn't Auror Caxton given you a lead from her interviews? Hermione sat down behind her desk and began to note her initial findings.
They were all dead ends. Nobody saw anything, which means some kind of magic was used to conceal the body dump.
Malfoy, please go do some paperwork in your own office. I will let you know as soon as I find anything worthwhile. She waved her hand at him, hoping he'd leave her alone. He moved to the door, then hesitated for a moment.
Don't sleep in your office.
With that, he left. It was late, and Spliff had closed for the night. Hermione stood in a single pool of light, going over the now cleaned bones of the victim. She held a collarbone in her hands, running her fingers over the surface, feeling for any inconsistencies. There was the sound of a throat clearing just below her, pulling her attention from her examination. Malfoy was lying on her examination table. His eyes caught hers.
Come on, Granger. Put me back together.
The rest of him was just a skeletal frame. On the table next to her lay bowls holding his internal organs. As if she were completing a puzzle, she placed each organ back where it belonged. When she picked up his heart in her cupped hands, she noticed it was still beating.
Be careful, it's fragile,
Draco said quietly from his prone position. Once his organs were all back in place, she slid his muscles into that position, the tendons clicking into place like Legos. Finally, she pulled her skin over his frame, the edges melting together seamlessly. All the while, Hermione heard a song playing in the background. Maybe she'd forgotten to turn off the MP3 player in her office. It was Secretly by Skankanansi. As she ran her fingers along the final skin seam around his neck, Malfoy sat up and pulled her into the V of his legs.
Good job. Now we need to test that everything works.
He obnoxiously wiggled his eyebrows, took her right hand and placed it on his erection. She ran her fingers along the length. Seems to be in working order.
Maybe in the lab, but we need to field test it.
He removed her hand from his cock and entangled their fingers before gracefully hopping off the table. In one fluid motion, he turned her to rest against the table and dropped to his knees. Malfoy ran his hands up her leg and pushed her skirt and lab coat up to bundle around her waist.
No knickers.
He arched a brow and smirked up at her. Hermione grabbed at the edge of the table as he nuzzled his nose along her force. Oh, fuck! The head fell back as her hips thrust forward, urgently rubbing herself against his lips, chasing her climax. His stubble scraped along her inner thigh, creating a delicious contrast to the softness of his tongue laving her entrance. Hermione's knees began to shake against his shoulders as a wave of elation rolled through her body. Her hands alternated between grabbing the table edge and his head to pull him even closer to her core. He groaned, and the vibrations traveled through her core, causing the first crest of her orgasm to finally burst with her release. She pushed at his shoulders, forcing him to lean back until he lay on the floor, and with some deft hip rolls impaled herself on his cock. Hermione woke up with a gasp as the grunt of Malfoy reaching his orgasm echoed in her mind. Hermione wasn't hiding in her office the next morning. She was just reducing the chances of running into Malfoy. Malcolm had the isotope analysis results, and she had instructed him to advise Malfoy accordingly. So when a cup of coffee from Bean Me Up appeared on her desk, she knew her plan had been thwarted. She looked up from her desk, spotting someone in her office. "We do actually have a decent coffee machine in our break room," she said, taking the coffee anyway, but refusing to look up at Malfoy. This meant that his ridiculous belt buckle, with its image of an arrow pointing up with the word wizard beneath it, and an arrow pointing down with the word centaur above it, was in her eye line, and kept reminding her of a wild dream, which was not helping at all.
"Why did your intern nearly throw himself at me to stop me from coming here? It's as if I've offended you somehow, and now you're avoiding me," he asked, confused. "I'm not avoiding you. It's good practice for my intern to learn how to properly communicate with Aurors." "I'm sure it is, but you're so much better at explaining this. You know I don't speak Muggle science, Granger."
With immense effort, Hermione raised her head and sat back in her office chair. She could feel a blush begin to heat the skin of her chest as her eyes met his. She opened her copy of the report and began to explain their findings to him. In the midst of her explanation, Malfoy dug a sachet of sugar out of his pocket, tore it open with his teeth, poured the sugar into his cup, removed a piece of paper that had stuck to his lip, licked it, and then sipped his coffee.
It was practically pornographic.
Her mind even supplied a Bow Chicka Wow Wow soundtrack.
"I'm sorry, but what is Bow Chicka Wow Wow?"
Shit, bugger ass, she'd said it out loud. A very technical term for someone who's a muggle. There was a brief pause as Hermione prayed to every deity and Nikola Tesla himself that Malfoy would buy her lie.
"The victim's a muggle?"
Hermione nodded.
"Well, Bow Chicka Wow Wow,"
Malfoy murmured. To be continued. Thank you for listening to The Magic in the Marrow by Tygermine, read by Max Mabella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, AO3, Tumblr, or Instagram.